So the last section that we just learned about was sections 19.1 and 19.2, which you have read and should be very familiar with, which deal with taxonomy and Linnaeus. You should know Linnaeus, like he's your best friend. And kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. You know all that. And then 19.2 talks about the 3 domains of life. So you should be very familiar with those and know what those are. Then also having read 19.3, we learn about how we put all this information together to learn about evolutionary history. So your textbook starts off by defining systematic biology as the study of evolutionary history of biodiversity. And so basically, we're looking at all of life, so all of the 3 domains, and studying how did we get to be so diverse? How did we evolve, humans, the same or as much as we did over billions of years, where some bacteria haven't changed at all, right? So we're looking at that. How are we related to bacteria? Because you know that we have a common ancestor with bacteria, the last universal common ancestor, like Darwin talked about. So that's what systematics is studying the evolutionary history of the biodiversity of life. And phylogeny is a map that you put on a piece of paper to visualize this. So some of the terms that you need to know are ancestral traits, which is found within a group of living things, a clade, so an ancestor and all of its descendants, and that ancestor has a trait and all of its descendants have it. So that's called an ancestral trait because the ancestor has it, right? Then there's also derived traits. Derived traits evolved after the common ancestor. So for example, all mammals have mammary glands and make milk for their young, right? But not all, so that's an ancestral trait for all of mammals. But then if we're going to look at humans or primates, which are another group of mammals, we have evolved the use of opposable thumbs. So that is a derived character for our clade of primates, whereas the mammary glands are an ancestral trait. So it's important to remember that both ancestral and derived, these are relative terms, which your textbook goes into deep explanation of. So basically, here's the mammals that your textbook chooses to talk about. We start off with all mammals have the ancestral trait of mammary glands because our common ancestor, whatever it was that all mammals evolved from, had a common ancestor from, that had mammary glands. And then we split off into different groups. The 2 that your textbook looks at are primates and artiodactyl. And so they evolved even-toed hooves, and we evolved opposable thumbs. So our derived character is opposable thumbs, and theirs is even-toed hooves. But this is a relative term because it's derived within mammals, but if we're looking at just the clade of primates, so all primates as a whole, in that case, opposable thumbs is an ancestral trait because the primate common ancestor had it. Same thing with Artiodactyla. Within mammals, even-toed hooves is a derived character, but within Artiodactyla, it's an ancestral character because their common ancestor had it. So then after it breaks down further. So if we're looking at Artiodactyla, the ancestral trait is even-toed hooves. The derived characters would be antlers for deer, for the Cervidae, and horns for the family Bovidae. Same thing within primates. If we're looking at primates as a clade, the ancestral trait is opposable thumbs, but the derived characters are prehensile tails for the family Cebidae and full rotating shoulder joints for the family Hominidae. So we have full rotating shoulder joints. That is a derived character that we have. Our ancestral character for primates is our opposable thumbs. So next your textbook starts talking about cladistics, and this is the kind of the method that's used to make a hypothesis about evolutionary history. So what it does is it looks at a bunch of different traits and says whether or not you have them or you don't have them, and makes patterns and uses the most likely explanation to make a hypothesis. Now, this is called parsimony. Parsimony is the idea that the simplest explanation is probably the one that's right. Not always, definitely not, but probably. So if we're going to look at this is how cladistics works. We start off with this diagram, and we have a bunch of different living things, and we have a bunch of different traits. And you just check off whether or not you have them or you don't. And so it's pretty safe to say that the common ancestor between all of the vertebrates in the lancelet derived a vertebrae and split off. Then another group evolved 4 limbs, and the tuna did not evolve 4 limbs, so it went a different way. Then the frog did not evolve an amniotic egg, so that went off a different evolutionary pathway from us down here. This is where it gets tricky. So next we can see that the finch, the crocodile, and the lizard have a gizzard and epidermal scales, and the dog and the chimpanzee have hair and mammary glands. Now it makes the most sense that here those paths diverge like this: dog and chimpanzee, and then the finch, crocodile, and the bird or the lizard, right? Because it doesn't make very much sense that we all went down the same evolutionary pathway, and then afterwards the chimp and the dog lost the gizzard and the epidermal scales. And that easily could have been the case. They could have evolved them and then secondarily lost them, but it doesn't make the most sense. And we know that that's not what happened. For example, a whale doesn't have legs. So if legs were one of these characters, it wouldn't have them, but it would have every single other thing that a mammal has, because whales are mammals. So we could assume that whales are mammals and they secondarily lost their legs, because it makes a lot more sense than thinking that they are a fish and somehow on their own they evolved every other character that a mammal has. And so this idea of parsimony basically means the simplest one is going to make the most sense. The one with the fewest amount of evolutionary changes is going to make the most sense. So there's fewer evolutionary changes in thinking that the chimp and the dog split off from the finch and the crocodile and the lizard. So that's one evolutionary change, as opposed to this and all of those other evolutionary changes to get them back to where they were. So that's the idea of parsimony. And then we always need an outgroup, and an outgroup is whatever is not included in the trait that we're looking at. So in this case, the lancelet is the outgroup because they do not have a vertebrae. So they are an outgroup for the group of vertebrae. And we need an outgroup to compare it to, just like we need a control variable and when we're doing an experiment. We need an outgroup to say that vertebrae is a common characteristic, a shared derived character for all of the vertebrates. Because if you didn't compare it to something else, you couldn't say with confidence vertebrates are only in these things, because you have no evidence that they're not in something else. So that's what you need an outgroup for. So this lancelet is the outgroup to this whole in-group right here. Ooh. So then we can turn this into a picture. This is a cladogram. This is the entire goal. It shows how evolution happened. It shows that there was a common ancestor, and the lancelet evolved, and another group evolved, and this group evolved vertebrae. So that is an ancestral trait for all of these things right here, vertebrae. And not the lancelet, so the lancelet is the outgroup. Then the tuna kept along its evolutionary pathway, and another group split off, and that group evolved 4 limbs. And so the common ancestor of the frog, lizard, crocodile, finch, terrier, and chimp, they all had 4 legs, so on and so forth. Then we see up here that there was a common ancestor that had an amniotic egg, and it went 2 different ways. One group evolved epidermal scales, another one evolved hair and mammary glands. So this solution makes the most parsimonious sense. It's the most parsimonious solution, so this is the one that's accepted. And that's kind of how it works. And so this is a testimony to the fact that we're not always right, that our hypotheses are truly hypotheses, that we are doing the best that we can with the information that we can, and this is why science is ever changing. So before, think about it, Linnaeus only had morphological traits to go off of. He didn't have anything else. And so he never would have thought that a finch is more closely related to a crocodile than a lizard is. You look at a crocodile, you look at a lizard, crocodile kind of looks like an overgrown lizard. But in reality, a bird is more closely related to a crocodile than a lizard is. So that's why this is always changing. So there's a bunch of different types of evidence that we make these phylogenies out of. The first one, and the one that's been used for hundreds and hundreds of years, like I just said, is morphological data, because that's all that they had. And so I just gave you some downsides to that. Some other ones are homologous structures. So, I guess not downsides, ups, just things to think about. Homologous structures. So you might not think that humans and birds and bats and horses, that we are related to each other, but homologous structures such as the bones in our forearms provide evidence that we did at one time share a common ancestor, because in that common ancestor had the same 4 bones in its forelimbs that all of ours did. And then there's convergent evolution, which can be tricky, because if we're going off of strictly morphological data and you see 2 things that look exactly the same, pretty likely to think that they're more closely related than something that doesn't look the same. But think about it. 2 living things that are evolving in the exact same environment and they're fitting into the same niche, they're probably going to evolve pretty similar traits. And so that's how that happens. That's how convergent evolution happens. That's how analogous structures happen. Think about those cichlids that lived in that lake in Africa. They evolved to look almost identical, and they weren't very closely related. So you have to be careful with things like that. You should also be very confident with homologous, analogous, convergent evolution by now. Your textbook loves to talk about it. Then there are behavioral traits that we can use. So this is things like there were a bunch of different kinds of frogs called leopard frogs that scientists believed were all the same or related to each other. But then after studying their mating calls, they realized that they weren't actually very related to each other. They are in different evolutionary lineages, but they just happen to evolve to look the same. Another thing would be that dinosaurs cared for their young very similarly to both crocodiles and birds. So that behavioral data provides evidence that dinosaurs and crocodiles and birds had somewhat of a common ancestor. There's also fossil traits, which I skipped over by accident, and we know that the fossil record is so helpful, but it has giant holes in it. Whole lineages are missing, and only hard parts get fossilized. So that's why we're missing so much information from the fossil record, and why fossil record doesn't provide that much information about plants, because plants don't have too many hard parts. But it can be helpful. We can find out that dinosaurs did care for their young through the fossil record, things like that. And lastly, on the forefront of science right now is the molecular data that we can use for this. So the first one is just DNA structure. And this is relatively new, but very, very cutting edge. So basically, you look at the base pair sequences, and you see how much are similar. So for example, here's a bunch of mammals. You can see that at number 2, or base pair 2, 5, 6, 8, 10, 11, or 10, 12, all mammals have the same letter. So you can say that a T at base pair number 6 of this gene is an ancestral trait for mammals, because our common ancestor probably had that T right there and gave it to all of us. But you can also see that at base pair number 3, humans and chimps evolved a T where everything else has a C. So we derived this character. Same thing, we have a couple other very close similarities with chimpanzees. So that's how you can use molecular data from your DNA to make guesses, make cladograms, find the most parsimonious solution to evolution. Scientists usually use mitochondrial DNA. Remember that the majority of our DNA is housed inside of our nucleus, but we do have some DNA inside of our mitochondria. And the reason that they use this is because mitochondrial DNA evolves much, much faster than nuclear DNA. By evolves, I mean accumulates mutations. And so it makes more sense to use mitochondrial DNA, especially when you're studying something that has diverged so recently as humans and chimpanzees, because our common ancestor in evolutionary time was incredibly recently. So if you just look at a really slowly evolving gene, you're not going to get any data. We're going to look identical to a chimpanzee. So you need to use something that's evolving much quicker. That way it had the opportunity to accumulate changes. So you can see that chimps have evolved something different, a different C right here than humans. So it is important to look at something that's evolving quickly. Then there's also protein comparisons. So before we had any of this data, or this technology, scientists could still isolate proteins. So they would isolate proteins from cell membranes of one species, inject it into another species, and see if there was a reaction. And so if there was no reaction, it's pretty likely that there hasn't been too much of a change in that protein because the new body still recognizes it. But if you were to eject our protein into a rabbit, they may have an adverse reaction because they don't recognize it as their own because it's changed so much over time. So that's kind of the old way of doing things. Then there's also the whole concept of a molecular clock, which looks at how mutations accumulate over time. There's an animation online I want you to watch on that one. And that is the end of chapter 19.3.